Welcome to another episode of the 20-minute-ish rabbit hole. I'm calling this one Days of Our Lives because it has everything to do about our stories. And that's why I'm recording it as a podcast. I don't know any better way to talk about stories than to literally talk about stories. I'm reading this book. It's a phenomenal book. It's called The Starless Sea. It's something completely different to what I normally read. And when I read this book, something in it re-inspired me to talk about our stories and the stories that we tell ourselves, because it made me think of it in a different way. Now, I've been fascinated about this concept of the stories that we tell ourselves pretty much ever since that fateful session I had with a counselor. And that session actually resulted in one of my favorite articles that I entitled Pause for the Cause. It's all about that think, feel, do cycle. But in between and around the think and feel part is our stories. The stories that we tell ourselves. We have a thought and an emotion, and somewhere in between, and what I propose in a later article to be kind of a continuous circle or cycle, is the stories that we tell ourselves, which can really amplify the emotions. It's really important to understand the stories that we tell ourselves. And that process basically is the basis for what is known conventionally as CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. Because to shift our behaviors in a meaningful way, i.e. to develop as people, become better, more aware, more thoughtful people, and stop shitting on each other. Never mind. I'll refrain from jumping up on that soapbox. But to really own our behaviors and to start shifting them, it means that we need to start really digging into those thoughts and emotions and the stories that we tell ourselves that amplify those emotions. If we don't learn to listen or to hear our own stories that we're telling ourselves, then we'll never be able to change our behaviors in any meaningful way. So in that way, shifting our behaviors is pretty much one and the same to shifting or changing those stories that we tell ourselves. So the hard part is that so many things inform these stories that we tell ourselves. Some are conscious. Most, I would argue, are subconscious. We all have limiting beliefs about ourselves. We're all conditioned by the way we were raised and the society that we were raised in and the values that we were raised around. And these all inform our stories. For example, I tell myself, and this is going to sound like a dumb example, but I tell myself, I don't have very good balance. I can't ride a bike. So I don't ride a bike. Now I know that's a lie. I could ride a bike if I really wanted to. But on a much, much more powerful and fundamental level, we all have these things that we tell ourselves we can't do because, I don't have enough money, or that's not practical, or I've got to take care of my family and children, so I can't do that. We all have these limiting beliefs about ourselves. And we also all tell ourselves stories about how we grew up that may or may not be actually true. There's what we remember versus what our memory actually warps. Fascinating studies about memory is that we only remember as well as the last time we told ourselves the story, which means, in a Chinese whispers kind of way, the story changes over time. But that's kind of that's a sidebar. So I thought I'd give some examples of my own horrible stories that I used to tell myself and how it relates to my chronic anxiety disorders that I used to struggle with until I started practicing some of these CBT methods. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder when I was 17, I think, and then I was diagnosed with panic disorder in my 20s. And it took me a long time to be able to recognize the horrible stories I was telling myself. And the real crux of these stories is that they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Here's an example. I'm driving down the road one day, and I stop at a red light. It's when I lived in Denver. I stopped at a red light, and I started to smell burnt bread. And within a tenth of a fucking second, all of a sudden my brain was saying, oh, when people smell burnt bread, it means that they're going to have a stroke. I'm having a stroke. Oh my God. And I had a panic attack. I started having a panic attack. Now, the really fun and interesting thing about panic attacks is whatever we think is wrong with us, our bodies will actually mimic those symptoms. So sure enough, one of my arms went numb. I got this funny metallic taste in my mouth. My vision started getting blurry. I was manifesting the symptoms of what I believe to be a stroke, all because I smelled burnt bread. And in my panic, I started fucking looking around. I was panicking in my car. I was at a red light. I was thinking, oh my God, if the light turns green, I don't know what I'm gonna die. Rah. I mean, this is what it's like to have a panic attack. You just fully lose your shit. And you honest to God think you're gonna die. Well, I looked over, and wouldn't you know, I'm right next to a fucking bread factory. Of course I smelt burnt bread. I was literally right next to a bread factory. And as fast as the symptoms came on of a self-professed stroke, they went away because I realized I was smelling bread from the fucking bread factory, and I had brought that situation upon myself. But I told myself a story of how I was going to have a stroke. That's just one example of a lifetime of thinking, oh my God, I don't have enough money. Oh my God, I'm trapped here. Oh my God, I'm like, fill in the goddamn blank. I'm going to flunk out of school. I'm going to be alone my whole life. Like, these are the stories I kept telling myself, and they were all negative. So of course I had generalized anxiety syndrome. I never told myself a happy story. It was always tragic. I had to face the confronting fact that I choose to believe these negative stories that I tell myself. And yes, it probably has a lot to do with how I was raised and the environment that I was raised in and how my parents thought, but it does not mean that I have to fucking stay that way, right? This is the gift of awareness. Once we become aware of these things, we can start to shift them. We can't shift them if we're not aware of them. And it takes time and fucking courage and a willingness to uncover some of these stories and confront these stories that we tell ourselves. So yes, This is what the pause is all about. I had to learn to hear my stories. And to do that, you have to be quiet and sit and listen and ask ourselves, what is the story I'm telling myself? And am I willing to confront it? Am I willing to sit with it and think, is it the truth or is it lies that I'm telling myself? Because I'm telling you, when we tell ourselves a story that does not serve us, that does not drive behaviors that we can be proud of, then it's time to fucking get rid of them. It is time to create a new story. But man, this takes practice, right? I'm still practicing and I'm still not great at it. I know I'm recording this podcast, but I do this stuff because I'm in this shit. Like I am doing this in real time. And it's really hard, especially when these stories replay like broken records. When they play on a continuous loop. For years and years, that's why I was absolutely controlled by my anxiety. Because these negative thoughts, they would just keep playing and playing and playing and spurring these horrific behaviors that I was ashamed of and had a hugely negative impact on my life. By thinking negative, my life became negative. And once again, that's the crux of the situation, is these stories that we tell ourselves, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. So now, let's shift. How do we shift it then? I'll take it back to this book. And a character in this book was, this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's such a beautiful book. She was sailing on a sea of honey. And she was talking about how the boat and the sea and the sails and everything around her, she created by just thinking about it over and over and over again. And I know that this is a story, right? This is fiction. But it made me realize, when I looked back at the times when I was anxious, and those stories that I told myself to continually fuel my anxiety, I was like, holy shit, I can change that. We can use the fact that we tell ourselves stories, because we will, no matter what. We can use this to our advantage to create better lives for ourselves. If we don't like a story that we're telling ourselves, we can change it. It takes creativity, it takes bravery, and it takes a little bit of fucking craziness, if I'm honest. Because we have to truly believe that we can change our stories, and it will change our lives. But I think it's possible. 100% I do. I've done it. I've done it without even realizing it. We are all storytellers. We are the storytellers. We are the creators of our story. When we realize that, it now becomes a choice to tell ourselves a negative story or to tell ourselves a positive story. Here's one way I did it, and I didn't even realize it, in a positive way. I told myself ever since I was, 17, that I would live in New Zealand someday. I told myself I will be a Kiwi someday. And it took me 30 until I was 30. But it happened. I can't articulate how I did it. It honestly felt like one goddamn mistake after another. But here I am. My life is so unrecognizable to the person I was that day I had that panic attack in that car. There's no way to articulate it, how different I am. So there is true power. Now, there's going to be some spin-offs of this because there's a lot that goes into our stories. There's a lot of influencing factors, again, that are both conscious and subconscious. It has so much to do with how we communicate with ourselves and others around us. And it has a lot to do with the conditioning of the world around us. And those stories that we tell ourselves, they're all shaped by all of it. And it's the swirling mass of chaos. But it doesn't change the fact that we are the creators of those stories. We might not be able to control the thoughts, but we can control the stories that we tell ourselves. Now, just lastly, I'll leave with this intriguing thought, because this happened to me once. There's the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and our upbringing and what we know about ourselves. But if you ever want to get some perspective, listen to the way a close friend or even an acquaintance tells part of our stories. And ask yourself, is that accurate? Because that's the true gauge of how close we are to the person that people perceive us to be. This happened to me listening to a friend of mine relate a part of my story or part of my life to other people. And I thought, holy shit, that's interesting. I'll leave it there. There's so much about this, our stories. What stories are we telling ourselves, people? And how willing are we to really own those stories? What does owning those stories even look like? Something to have a think about.